Welcome to DIE-ALOGUE podcast. I am your host, Rebekah Sebastian, and today we're moving along in part 3 of our series called Missing Murdered in the Media. So far, we've explored this subject through the perspectives of a social media and podcast creator, an academic and researcher, and today we will speak with a journalist, which only seems fitting since we're talking so much about the mainstream media. Her name is Tamar Sarai Davis. She's a reporter at Prism. Prism is a nonprofit independent media organization. They're doing their work a little bit differently, and we'll get into that in the interview. I came across Tamar's article on Lauren Smith Fields, reached out to her to share her perspective on the nuances of Lauren's case and the role that the media plays. So listen along and be sure to check the show notes for some resources that Tamar shared with us. I really believe this topic is so important, so please share this interview and the other ones in the series on your social networks and with your friends and family. Let's do our part to help bring some balance to the media coverage and also shine a light on the fact that this is even a problem. Because as has come up in several of these conversations, how can people be expected to care about things they don't even know about? So let's help them know. With that, here is my conversation with Tamar Sarai Davis. Tamar, welcome to DIE-ALOGUE podcast. I am really excited that you're here today to talk with us about this important conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Likewise, I found you through an article when doing my research for this series. I was specifically looking into the case of Lauren Smith Fields, and I found an article you wrote for Prism, and I thought that could be a good way to start. So I'd love to hear a bit about your background and story and where you are reporting now.
Yes, definitely. So I started my journalism career actually in school. So I went to Columbia Journalism School and graduated in 2020. And soon after, I joined the team at Prism. And so I've been there for about 2 years now. And I was really drawn to the reporting done at Prism because it's very solutions oriented. And they really focus on telling stories from the perspective of the people who are most directly impacted by the issues that we're covering. And so I joined Prism focusing kind of explicitly on covering the criminal legal system with a focus on the ways the system impacts Black women and girls. And then from there, I've kind of branched out my reporting focuses, and I cover actually feature stories now. So they're a bit longer form opportunities for me to kind of dig a bit deeper into stories than if I were just kind of like breaking news or doing weekly news stories. A lot of the more recent pieces I've done look very similarly to the story you're talking about that I covered Lauren Smith Fields' case. They're a bit longer, and they're giving me an opportunity to dive deeper into a particular case and look at all of the different kind of societal influences that that particular case might speak to. So I really enjoy the work that Prism is doing, and I'm very happy to be there.
So at Prism, I read that it's a nonprofit, and I was wondering, how does that impact its ability? Are you just less, is the organization just less beholden to funders? I would imagine they're free from some of the constraints that allows them to report differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a lot more freedom, I would say, to kind of cover corporations, cover politicians with a lot more of like a critical eye. Yeah. And like you said, we're definitely, not beholden to advertisers in the same way that a lot of for-profit media companies are. So definitely provides so many different opportunities. And I think what Prism does that's maybe unique even in the nonprofit media space is that we have a lot of contributing writers, a lot of freelance writers who are organizers in their own communities, and they have a lot of really cool insight that just a traditional trained journalist wouldn't have. So we're able to do a lot of different kind of fun stuff that makes us really unique in this space.
So let's talk about that piece that you wrote about Lauren Smith Fields. I'd love to know a couple of things, how you found out about her story, and then specifically the way you covered it, you really dug into the use of TikTok and specifically Black creators on social media and how they changed the trajectory of her case through using those platforms. So I'm curious how you, as a reporter, found Lauren's story and why you chose that angle with which to cover it.
So I learned about Lauren's story on social media. I'm kind of always on Twitter, always on TikTok, and had seen a few videos just highlighting her story. And then I kind of really got into it after reading a piece on Refinery 29, their Unbothered vertical, which focuses on stories related to like Black women and girls. And it was just about like the absence of media coverage on her case, or by that time, how long had it taken mainstream media to take up her story. Yeah. So I was kind of introduced to Lauren's story through the angle of how neglected it was by traditional press. And I knew I wanted to cover her story in some way. By the time I started reporting, it was early February. So by that time, a lot of mainstream outlets had already begun covering her story, but I was really interested in like digging into the role that social media played. I think that a lot of pieces kind of offhandedly mentioned how her story was elevated by TikTokers, but I really wanted to like dig into that and really on a kind of like celebrate and honor the role they played in elevating her story. I think that it was a little bit lost in the overall story about her case. And I wanted to highlight it and get into like, what does it mean that, you know, these social media content creators are kind of driving the news cycle when it comes to stories of interest to Black women and girls. And yeah, that's kind of how that story ideated.
Yes. Okay, good. So let's get into it. What does it mean? And it's so obvious to me, the upside, right? It's like visibility, awareness. Things can move so much faster on TikTok and Twitter than they can, you know, in print media, of course, and even the news cycle. So I get that the visibility comes with social media. People can't care about something they don't know about. So more people are using these platforms, so they're seeing it. But what is the downside and what are the complexities around it? Because it's clear, I think, what the purpose is and the good intentions behind it. But your article was interesting to me because it went much deeper than that surface level.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that what you were just speaking to, the speed of which you can share these stories on platforms like TikTok and Twitter, that's definitely a positive, but it can also create challenges and limitations. So some of the TikTok creators that I spoke to discussed how there's this kind of urgency with which they want to cover these stories. There's a high demand from their followers who want to know how the stories are unfolding. They want updates, but they don't have the kind of resources that a traditional news outlet would have, namely fact checkers, right? Yes. So they might get updates about a story. You know, one of the people that I spoke to, Jay Stokes, he was one of the first people to make a TikTok video about Lauren Smith Fields. And he actually had connections to different people in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So he was able to get a lot of updates about her case before the local press even covered it. But he felt uncomfortable sharing those updates on his page because he didn't have fact checkers. You know, he wasn't seen as like a quote unquote like legitimate news source. So he kind of had to sit on a lot of updates because he wanted to wait until the local and national media broke those stories. So I think there's sometimes a contention between the desire of someone's followers to kind of get these consistent updates and ethical concerns from these users who don't have, you know, as robust resources as a traditional outlet. So that's one, you know, big limitation. And I think the other main one that everyone that I spoke to for this piece talked about was comment moderation. So on their pages, they want to leave their comment section open so that they can field questions from their followers. They can get updates from their followers, but it's difficult when you have, you know, hundreds of thousands of people looking at your videos to filter out some of the negative, you know, hateful, victim blaming comments that don't just impact like your own mental health, but you also recognize that, you know, Lauren's family is following your page. They're going to see these comments about their loved one. I think just that filtering out process by one person can be really taxing and really difficult. And it's something that a larger newsroom doesn't have to contend with in the same way because they have a dedicated social media team who can help handle that. But one person, that's really difficult.
So did you come away with a feeling overall? It sounds like you really respect and support these independent content creators and what they're doing. And you're a journalist, and I'm not. I'm a podcaster, right? So I don't have the same ethical obligation to impose some of those on myself. And it sounds like one of the subjects you spoke to, it sounds like he had a very strong sense of, the line that he wasn't willing to cross. But when you don't have those and you're operating outside of that, it does get a little bit tricky. And I remember during the Gabby Petito story, which is relevant because I think it's when the conversation around missing white woman syndrome really resurfaced in our country. The jumping onto those stories and the updates became like this voracious cycle, and the energy around it was almost insatiable. Like you were talking about users demanding the updates, and I saw that happening and it really freaked me out. So I'm just wondering, this is your professional work. How do you view that responsibility? Is that something independent creators should have to bear or no?
That's a good question. I don't think that it's a responsibility they should have to bear. I think that it's an incredibly high ask to have one person, be tasked with following a story in the same way that a dedicated journalist or an entire newsroom would. Right. I think that what was unique about, Lauren's story and the people who were following her story on TikTok was that I think they just recognized that they were going to have to be the ones to stay on top of this story because it was involving a Black woman, and because we know how often stories about missing and murdered Black women and girls are neglected by the mainstream media. I think that they definitely felt that pressure and demand from their followers, but I think that they also not placed it upon themselves, but they also understood why that demand was so high and kind of pushed themselves to rise to the occasion. I don't think it's the way that it should be, but I definitely do think that there's this understanding that that's the way that it is right now. Mm-hmm. And so there's a particular type of responsibility that I think, any maybe person of color who is concerned about these types of stories places upon themselves. I hope that's answering your question.
It does. So am I kind of hearing this, that there's sort of a greater good and a cause behind this, that it's not that there's wrongdoing, but it just would forgive any of those standards that don't exist because this is an independent space. And right, you're saying the expectation shouldn't be on an independent creator who's not a dedicated paid employee of an organization to cover a story, and that the larger purpose is the goal, and that's to raise the visibility and the awareness. That's more important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I do want to say that the overall telling of the story, the getting the information out there is, of the utmost priority. But I do think that even in the example that I shared earlier about the content creator who had these sources in Bridgeport, a part of the reason why he didn't share them was, both kind of the ethical considerations, but also the particular updates he was getting. He realized he needed context around them, or else they could be misconstrued, right? So he had details about her autopsy report that had yet to be released that said she had drugs in her system. I think he recognized what it would mean for him to share that particular update without fact checking and without, a larger context, what that could say about, or what people could come away with. Yes. When that update is about, a young Black woman, right? So it's there's so many kind of different elements of why certain things aren't shared, and what you would need to back up certain details, given who it's about.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance, and that's very discerning of him, really. Because you could imagine just sharing that information, what it would do in terms of if you were only worried about clicks and going viral.
Right. And being first. Yeah.
Yes. So let's talk about the specific ways it did change her case. It sounds like when you got involved in the story, the national mainstream media was starting to pay attention. And is that as a result of this noise that was happening, this rising up in social media? Is that how you find mainstream media often responds to cases right now? Are they listening to what's percolating in these other spaces?
Yeah, I absolutely think that her story kind of got that mainstream attention because of all of the noise that was being made on social media. And I think that in Lauren's case in particular, the action and the constant like upliftment by TikTokers, by Twitter users helped her case like at different points. So it kind of got her story on the national map by early to mid-January. And I think at the end of January, when the autopsy report was released, there was similar outrage about the conclusions that were made as a result of the report. And I think that the renewed sense of interest of her case then pressured the Bridgeport Police Department to open the criminal investigation and to suspend the officers that were involved in her case, right? So there were, at different points, there were different conversations that were had on Twitter and TikTok that led to a lot of things that unfolded in her case. I also think that her case was impacted by social media, Black TikTok, Black Twitter. Even after the mainstream media took on her story, there were some troublesome ways in which they presented Lauren. So there were a lot of Black Twitter users and Black TikTok users that called out the pictures that they used when they were reporting on Lauren's story, how she was always, in a swimsuit, or she was shown partying, and just the kind of connotation that those stories had. I think Black Twitter users, Black TikTok users did a really great job of like holding the media to task. So it's not just like, I want you to report on the story, but I want you to make sure you report on it in a way that honors her life and that doesn't skew the framing and put ideas into people's mind based off of stereotypes that already exist about Black women and girls.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so true. Another person I'm speaking to in the series is an academic whose research is in the media portrayal of women and girls of color. And there are specific tactics, and they're different based on different groups. And I remember her saying for Latina women, there's like a risk-taking kind of language around their descriptions. And for Black women, they often talk about their employment status. And they didn't do that with the white counterparts, which was, I'm guessing, unconscious bias about us. I think it's there to create more of a reason for us to care. It was my takeaway that it was almost needed to guide a person, a viewer or a reader to say, well, she had a job. She was a contributing member of society, so therefore we can care. And I'm curious if you would interpret that the same way. When I heard that, that's sort of how I perceived it. But I find this all just so interesting that these pictures selected, these words that are used around victims and stories really matter.
Absolutely. Yeah. I hadn't heard about that finding, but I think that makes so much sense. And I think it, ties into just like respectability politics broadly. Like we can care about this woman if we believe her to have been an upstanding citizen or, a person who, like you said, contributes. And I think that in addition to the pictures used in her case, I think there was also a really important conversation around how she was like juxtaposed against her date before his identity was revealed. By the time I learned about her story, they were still discussing her as having gone on a date with like a quote unquote older white man, which I think some TikTok users called out as like suggesting there was like a sugar baby kind of relationship. That was not true. But yeah, I think that that's also another thing that was very subtle, but you could very much understand what stereotype it was playing into and what takeaways certain reporters were trying to create with that framing. Yeah.
Yeah. You've mentioned the detectives that were first involved being removed, and it seems as though that they've had some other mishandling of cases. But one of the most egregious things that I found in Lauren's story was the fact that police were called there and that there was no family notification. Do you see that a lot in stories? It seemed completely, I couldn't think of one good reason why they wouldn't be, given that she was in her own apartment. I mean, it wouldn't, and there was a landlord there who ended up being the one to communicate this to the family. It's not that they couldn't find them or get in touch. Did anything you investigated lead you to understand that decision?
Yeah, well, the same day that Lauren passed away, there was another woman, another Black woman, also in Bridgeport, who died. I believe she was murdered Brenda Rawls, and kind of the same exact thing happened. Her family was not notified. They found out 2 days later by asking the person whose home Brenda had gone to and where her body was found. And he was the one who told the family that she passed away. So it seems like it's a pattern, a trend in that police department. I'm sure there are lots of other departments where the same thing happens and family and loved ones aren't notified. I didn't get a sense of, why that happened. I think that in Lauren's case, at least, there was some discussion about like a relationship that the Bumble date had with the police department. So my understanding would be that it was just to kind of quiet things down and to not implicate him in anything, because obviously if your daughter was with this man the last time while she was alive, you would kind of probe and want to learn more about that person.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have any, concrete answers as to why that happened, but I do know that it seems that there's a pattern and trend of family and loved ones not being notified of the passing of their loved ones when it happens under mysterious circumstances.
Hey everyone, Rebekah here. It's that time again. We are gearing up for CrimeCon 2022. This year, the event will be held in Las Vegas, and the dates are April 29th to May 1st. I am already hard at work prepping my table for Podcast Row, and I'm involved in a couple of other exciting aspects of the event, and I really hope to see you there. Now, if you use the code DIALOGUE, that's DIEALOGUE, you'll get 10% off your regular standard pass. So go to crimecon.com to register, and again, use this code DIALOGUE, DIEALOGUE, for 10% off your pass. I hope to see you in Vegas. Hey listeners, I want to introduce you to Sinisterhood, a true crime comedy podcast that covers all things creepy and gives you the deep dives and thorough research I know you guys want. Best friends and longtime comedians Christy Wallace and Heather McKinney covered things like serial killers, disappearances, cults, and cryptids. They even do legal deep dives with Heather, a real-life lawyer, like their recent episodes on the wrongful conviction of Ryan Ferguson, a contestant on this season of The Amazing Race. While you're listening, make sure to subscribe to Sinisterhood via the link in the episode description on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also go to sinisterhood.com for more information. Yeah, I found that just really, really heartbreaking and hard to believe that there could be any reason. Before we move away from the social media conversation, I'm wondering how you feel about, because I do want to get past the high level social media conversation into some of the more uncomfortable weeds of performative justice. And how do we utilize all the good things about these platforms and attach some resources to them so maybe there's actual change spreading with the message, which is a lot less viral. Those posts, I think this is even part of your article, but one of the sources you spoke to talking about some of the content they posted versus other posts, performing better than others. And usually it's the more what we were talking about earlier, the kind of splashier updates and headlines, but also it's such a missed opportunity to put information that could be, life-saving, helpful, ways to get involved. Have you thought about this in your work as you've dug into these stories and ones like it?
Yeah, to kind of go back to what you were referring to, that user was talking about posts that were just about Lauren and about the negligence of the mainstream media performed a lot better than videos he made that were giving people calls to action. So
yes.
That had, phone numbers of the police department or local elected officials. Those just didn't seem to perform as well. And yeah, I think that social media is such an incredible tool for public education and amplifying stories, but it's also, in my opinion, the first and one of the lowest rungs on a far larger ladder of engagement. I think that the best way to make sure it doesn't become just a tool for performative justice is to allow it to introduce you to problems, introduce you to ideas, and be the first step in you getting engaged on what could be a really local level. I think it varies depending on what kind of social issue you're engaging in. But for this conversation about, missing or murdered women and girls, gender-based violence, sexual violence, I think that there are, grassroots groups in every city, every town that are working on like eradicating the roots of that violence. And that's a great way to plug in.
Right.
I think even like what people have done that's specific to Bridgeport of like looking into other cases is something that you can do in your own community and like learning a little bit more about what your police department is or is not doing. And kind of even just like reconceptualizing our reliance on police for solving and mediating these types of issues. I think there's so many like ways that you can get really, really micro and get really specific to where you live. And that's a great way of translating what you're learning about on social media into something that you can tangibly do to make things better.
Yeah. And do you think with time, maybe that will become a bigger part of these posts and campaigns? Do you think we'll get better at looking for those and attaching to those and not just like the hyped up moments of, like trauma that we want to share and like comment on? Do you think we're going to get better at that? Or do you think there's a risk of us kind of getting numbed out to it?
I hope we get better. I think I see a little bit more like numbing out at the moment. But I do think that, platforms like, TikTok and like Twitter, where anyone can create a story, where anyone can speak out about something, does create the opportunity for people to think a little bit more about like what's going on in their own community. Like I live in New York and go on TikTok and like learn about things that are very like hyper local to me. And I think that there's something of like the functionality, maybe TikTok even more than Twitter, that allows you to learn about what's going on where you are, that I think people can take advantage of it. Whether they're going to or not, I'm not sure, but I think that the tool is definitely there.
Yeah, the access is there. And that's the nice thing too, is it is accessible.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I would love to talk about this. We've certainly referenced the mainstream media throughout this whole conversation, but that's, that they've existed obviously longer than social media. And I would love to get your take on this kind of chicken versus egg question, which I'm posing to all my guests, which is this imbalance of coverage that I think we can all agree exists among the portrayal of missing and murdered women of color. Do you think it's a reflection of our cultural, societal values, or do you think those values and these systemic issues were there first and the media is repeating what already pre-existed?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's something I thought a lot about while reporting the story. I think that it starts with culture. I think it starts with like the society, and media is just born out of that. So I think that there are, stereotypes, there's, racism, misogyny, all of this stuff that already exists. And then I think that a lot of mainstream media outlets just adopt those values and shape their own priorities, their own coverage priorities around these kind of societal ills that were always there. I think that, when discussing Black women, missing or murdered Black women or Black women who were survivors or victims of sexual violence, something that I obviously think about is just like the stereotypes around that and the ways that Black women and girls are often denied innocence, denied the right to defend themselves or to be defended. And that's just something that, was already foundational to how we think about Black women and girls. And I think that the media has just taken that up in the way of like, who do they think deserves coverage?
Yeah.
And if it is a Black woman and girl, like what kind of criteria, like we were talking about earlier around like jobs or respectability, like what is the criteria that has to be attached to them to allow them to deserve that type of coverage? So yeah, I definitely think it's society first and then media. I do think that we're in a very like interesting time though, where the mainstream press is taking a lot of cues from social media and social media users are telling us like what they want to learn about, what they want to hear about, what stories they want covered. And I think that the mainstream press has like no kind of option other than to follow suit. I don't think that that means that they've like fundamentally changed their values. I don't think that it means that they have rethought what their priority should be, but I do think that they're kind of forced in some way to listen to stories that they hadn't had to before, or haven't felt that they had to.
Right. Ignoring it at this point would almost make them look stupid.
Exactly.
What about like a direct line between a consumer, a everyday citizen and journalists? Is there open lines of communications there? Do you see any of that where people are going, hey, this happened right in Bridgeport, and now we're looking into this and seeing all these other cases that were overlooked or mishandled, and talking to reporters for a change in the local news cycle? Is that something you're seeing as a trend?
I think that in order for that to happen, for there to be a closer tie between like readers or audience and even local journalists, is just like a trust that I don't think fully exists. I think in 2020, I remember just hearing a lot of conversations about the gaps between communities and the reporters who are tasked with covering them. And how, a lot of the times, like even local newsrooms don't reflect the diversity of the places that they're covering. And so I'm not sure it's even realistic or likely that a reader would feel comfortable getting that relationship with a reporter that hasn't, fully dedicated themselves to like really folding themselves into the community. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's like a question of just like meaningful like diversification of newsrooms. And when that happens, then that line and that tie between audience and reporters can just become stronger, and the coverage can reflect what people actually really want to hear about.
I feel like there's a parallel between what you're talking about, and it's a completely different conversation, so you don't feel like you have to speak into it, but between citizens and law enforcement, that there's an inherent distrust in some communities. Some communities, the local law enforcement doesn't reflect the makeup of their communities. And so there's tension. And the lines of communications very much don't feel open.
It's interesting. My conclusion and kind of like takeaway from the piece we've been discussing is like how both the news and the police just failed when it comes to Lauren's story. I did want to like make sure though that I wasn't drawing too tight of a correlation though, because I think that the police failed because in my view, they're not designed to offer the kind of protection that we want. Right. And so I think there's a lot of conversations about like this diversification of police forces. And I don't think that it yields the kind of results that people would hope to, because at the end of the day, the police, I think, are more of like perpetrators of violence than like violence preventers. I think that they're really fascinating institutions, media and law enforcement, just because what we rely on them to do, oftentimes they don't do. And the ways that we have to hold them accountable, though, are very different.
Yeah, I love hearing your perspective on that. I did want to talk about some of the stats in your article. If you could speak to some of these troubling numbers about missing Black women and girls, and specifically about their case stats in comparison to white counterparts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The main stat that I cited in my reporting was that 64,000 Black girls and women are missing in the United States, and cases involving them stay open 4 times longer than other cases on average. And that just stat, I think is like striking regardless. But I think for me, it really drove home to me why this issue of sustained media coverage is so important, because it really does have tangible influences. It has a tangible impact on how these cases are resolved. Like, it's not just important because it's the right thing to do. It's important because cases coverage correlates to the amount of pressure that's going to be placed on a police department or a state or local elected official to ensure that the case is solved. Like there's a really important tie between increased media coverage and increased allocation of resources. And so I think the fact that we don't know almost like any of the names of these Black women and girls who are missing plays a really big role in why their cases are staying open 4 times longer than the average.
Yeah, that second half of that statistic really struck me too, because as any, thoughtful person in true crime knows, time is of the essence in any missing person's case. So the fact that the help is not starting soon enough, it starts at point 1. And Lauren's case, unfortunately, is an example of that. She's not a missing person, but the notification, I mean, the facts around that and just the delay and just the lack of urgency around it and for missing people, that really kills a case. And so that's a really good one to be aware of, but also it's very sobering. What do you think is the best way for people like my listeners who care about these issues? How would you guide them if they wanted to take it a step further and learn more or do something extra?
I think that some of the, TikTok creators that even you've highlighted on your show, who focus specifically on cases involving women and girls of color is, a great place to start just to learn about these specific stories. There are a lot of Black true crime TikTok creators that create individual videos about stories every day. And some of those are still open. So, if you come across a story and you live in the area or you have connections in the area, I think that's like a great place to just get plugged in by following those accounts, following those podcasts, et cetera. And then I think also just what I mentioned, earlier about the kind of groundswell of just grassroots groups that are trying to get at the root causes of violence, particularly gender-based violence. That's a great place to plug into. And there are chapters in different cities, or even if you're just interested in it yourself and you want to have conversations with your family and friends about how to meaningfully address conflict and how to, support survivors. I think that there are just so many people who are already starting campaigns or already doing the work to get at those really nuanced but important questions to hopefully make this entire issue maybe not completely go away, but become far less prevalent than it is right now.
Yeah, those are really great. Have you read anything? Is there anything you're reading that's helpful?
There are some great articles that I can maybe share with you if you want to include them in your show notes. And I talk a lot about media representation of law enforcement, media representation of missing and murdered women in the context of the true crime genre, and how sometimes the sensationalism is quite dangerous and how it impacts the way that we take in these stories when we learn about them in real life. I've read some really great pieces that just interrogate fiction and nonfiction depictions of all of that entire issue that have been really, really great and really important for me. And then, this is a bit tangential, but I have been doing, a good number of stories about just how survivors of gender-based violence and sexual violence are, criminalized for defending themselves. And I think that does tie in when we're talking about how we see survivors and victims of violence when they're, people of color versus, white women. Yeah. And there are just, so many stereotypes that pervade our society that can have really negative impacts and influences, especially when they intersect with the criminal legal system. So I think that is it's tangential, but it is a bit relevant to what we're talking about today.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think it's completely relevant and it affects outcomes. I mean, that's just a fact.
The only thing I would add is that there are so many dimensions of how social media will impact news going forward that we can't even predict. And I think that it's just going to be really interesting to watch. And I hope that overall, the conversation we had around performative justice and taking things beyond social media, I hope that sparks a fire in listeners, and that people definitely do try to find ways to plug in beyond social media while also recognizing its importance and its potential.
Tamar, thank you so much for being on the podcast, for killing the small talk. DIE-ALOGUE is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebekah Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show, follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebekah Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebekahSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.